At 65 years old, I never imagined my life could still surprise me. I thought surprises were for the young, for people with busy schedules, crowded calendars, and futures that felt wide open. My future felt settled, quiet, predictable. My name is Beverly Mitchell, but everyone has always called me Bev. I've been a widow for 7 years now. My husband David passed away suddenly from a heart attack, one of those moments that divides life into before and after. Before David, I was a wife, a teacher, a woman with someone waiting for her at home. After David, I became something else entirely, someone learning how to exist in the silence. We were married for 42 years. 42 years of shared routines, shared arguments, shared laughter. We raised two children together, Sarah and Michael, who grew up, moved on, and built lives of their own. Now I have four grandchildren, the brightest parts of my world, even if they don't visit their old grandmother as often as I wish they would. I still live in the same house David and I bought back in the 1970s in what used to be a quiet part of Portland. Back then, the streets were calm, neighbors waved from porches, and everyone knew everyone else's name. These days, I barely recognize the place. Trendy cafes on every corner, young people zipping past on bicycles, houses selling for prices I can't even imagine. Sometimes I stand at my front window and feel like a stranger in my own neighborhood. Retirement hit me harder than I expected. I taught high school literature for over 30 years, and when that chapter ended, the days suddenly stretched too long, too empty. Losing David only deepened that emptiness. My world slowly shrank until it revolved around the simplest routines. Every morning, I make coffee and read the newspaper. Yes, a real paper delivered to my door. I tend to my small garden when my joints allow it. Occasionally, I meet my friend Marge from church for lunch. Evenings are usually spent watching television, the same home renovation shows playing in the background while I fold laundry that doesn't really need folding. Day after day, week after week. Still, I keep certain habits alive. Every morning, I put on lipstick, the same shade I've worn for decades. I dab a little perfume behind my ears, the kind David used to tease me about. I wear my pearl earrings, even when the only people who see me are the mail carrier or the grocery delivery boy. I suppose it's my way of reminding myself that I still exist, even when no one is really looking. My daughter Sarah has been gently, but persistently, nagging me about my bedroom furniture. She says it's outdated, worn, older than she is. And she's not wrong. David and I bought that wardrobe and dresser when Nixon was president. The drawers stick, one door doesn't close properly. But I've always believed that if something still works, you don't throw it away. That's how we were raised. But Sarah has her mother's stubborn streak. After months of convincing, I finally agreed to at least look at new options. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, a modern wardrobe was ordered. Delivery scheduled for the following Wednesday, assembly included. I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, it was just furniture, just another small change in a life that had already changed too much. The night before delivery, I went through my usual bedtime routine. Face cream, brushing my hair, flossing, my dentist would have been proud. Without thinking, I reached for my perfume and sprayed a little behind my ears. That's when I paused. Why was I putting on perfume before bed? The only person coming over tomorrow was a furniture delivery worker. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, really looked. The gray hair I'd stopped coloring, the lines around my eyes, the face of a woman who had lived a full life. And yet, there was something still there in my eyes, something awake. I went to bed that night restless, unable to sleep. I told myself I was just excited about the new furniture. But deep down, I felt something else stirring, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. I had no idea that by this time tomorrow, my quiet, predictable life would no longer feel quite so quiet or predictable ever again. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock Wednesday morning. I already knew that because I'd been awake since 6. The house was spotless, the coffee pot had been filled twice, and I'd changed my outfit more times than I cared to admit. In the end, I chose a simple pair of jeans and a soft blue sweater. Nothing fancy, just comfortable, sensible. Or at least that's what I told myself. I walked to the front door slowly, took a breath, and peered through the peephole. The man standing on my porch was not what I expected. Most delivery workers I'd encountered over the years were either very young boys rushing through the job or older men who looked tired before they even stepped inside. This man stood tall, relaxed, and calm, like he had nowhere else he'd rather be. He wore a company uniform, neatly pressed, and when I opened the door, he smiled in a way that instantly made the house feel less empty. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," he said. His voice was warm, steady. "I'm Jake. I'm here to assemble your wardrobe." For a second, I forgot how to speak. "Oh, yes," I said finally, stepping aside. "Please, come in." He wiped his boots carefully on the mat before entering, a small detail that caught my attention more than it should have. Respect showed itself in quiet ways, and I noticed those things now. As I led him through the living room, I became suddenly aware of my surroundings. The framed family photos, the worn coffee table David had refinished himself, the handmade quilt draped over my favorite chair. Jake glanced around, not with judgment, but with interest. "This is a beautiful home," he said. "They don't build places like this anymore." I felt a strange flicker of pride. My husband and I bought it almost 50 years ago, back when this neighborhood was very different. He nodded, genuinely listening, not just being polite. You can feel the history in it. No one had said something like that to me in years. The wardrobe boxes were already upstairs, and as we climbed the steps, I became acutely aware of how slowly I moved compared to him. He adjusted his pace without me asking, keeping a respectful distance. Another detail, another thing I noticed. At the bedroom door, I hesitated. This room had held my entire married life. Joy, arguments, secrets whispered in the dark, grief. Letting someone new into that space felt more significant than I expected. Jake waited patiently until I opened the door. "Well," I said, gesturing inside, "this is where it's all happening." He stepped in and immediately examined the old wardrobe. He ran a hand gently along the wood, nodding with appreciation. "This is solid craftsmanship. You don't see this kind of work anymore." For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe replacing it was a mistake. But then I remembered the stuck drawers, the crooked door, my daughter's worried expression. "It's time," I said quietly, even if it's hard to admit. He smiled, understanding more than I'd explained. Change usually is. As he unpacked his tools, I began removing my clothes from the old wardrobe. Dresses I hadn't worn in years, sweaters folded carefully by habit, a scarf David had brought me from a business trip long ago. Each item carried a memory, and I found myself slowing down. Jake noticed. "Take your time," he said gently. "No rush." That simple kindness nearly undid me. As the work continued, we talked about small things at first, the weather, the neighborhood, then gradually about family. I told him about my children and grandchildren. He spoke about his mother, about losing his father years ago. There was an ease to the conversation that surprised me. Sunlight streamed through the window as dust danced in the air, illuminating the room in a way I hadn't seen in years. I realized then how long I'd kept the curtains drawn in, not just in the bedroom, but in my life. At one point, I offered him coffee. He accepted with a grateful smile, and we stood there sipping quietly, surrounded by half-assembled furniture and half-unpacked memories. Something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but the room felt warmer, lighter, and so did I. When Jake returned to work, I sat on the edge of the bed watching him carefully assemble the wardrobe, his movements confident and patient. There was something comforting about watching someone build something piece by piece, something new, something functional, something solid. "You've done this a long time," I said. 8 years. I like working with my hands. Feels honest. I smiled. My husband was the same way. He paused just long enough to acknowledge that, then continued working, respectful of the weight behind my words. By the time the frame of the wardrobe stood upright, the room felt transformed, and so did the quiet rhythm of my heart. I didn't know why. I didn't question it. All I knew was this: what was supposed to be a simple delivery had become something else entirely. And I had the sudden, unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning. When the wardrobe frame finally stood on its own, tall and unfamiliar against my bedroom wall, Jake stepped back and studied it like an artist evaluating a canvas. He nodded once, satisfied, then reached for his tools again. "That's the easy part," he said. "The rest takes patience." Patience. The word settled into the room and stayed there. I told myself I was just tired, that the flutter in my chest was nothing more than the disruption of routine. For 7 years, nothing unexpected had crossed the threshold of my life. Now a stranger stood in the most private room of my house, quietly rearranging more than furniture. Jake moved carefully, measuring twice before tightening anything. He worked like someone who respected what could go wrong if he rushed. I watched from the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap, feeling oddly like a guest in my own room. "So," he said without looking up, "how long have you lived here?" "Nearly 50 years, I replied, "long enough that the house knows all my secrets." That made him pause, just for a second. "I believe that," he said softly. "Homes remember things." Something about that sentence made the room feel smaller, more aware, as if the walls were listening. While he worked, I began placing folded clothes onto the bed. Every movement felt louder than it should have: the rustle of fabric, the click of tools, the soft hum of a city waking up outside my window. Then I found it. A small box tucked into the far corner of the old wardrobe, one I hadn't opened since David passed. My fingers froze around it. I hadn't planned to look inside. I hadn't planned to remember. But some days don't ask permission. "What's that?" Jake asked gently, noticing the way I'd stopped moving. "Nothing important," I said too quickly. He didn't push, just nodded and turned back to his work. That restraint, his ability to let silence exist without filling it, made something tighten in my throat. I opened the box anyway. Inside were old notes, birthday cards, a faded photograph from decades ago. David and me, younger than I remembered, standing in front of this same house. I stared at the image until the edges blurred. "You okay?" Jake asked quietly. I swallowed. "Yes, just memories." He set his screwdriver down and looked at me, not with curiosity, but with understanding. "They can sneak up on you." That's when I realized something unsettling. He wasn't treating me like a fragile old woman, and he wasn't treating me like a problem to solve. He was simply there. When he returned to work, the wardrobe slowly transformed, panels sliding into place, shelves aligning, structure replacing emptiness. The old oak pieces leaned against the wall, waiting to be carried out, like a life chapter standing by the door. "Would you mind holding this for a moment?" Jake asked, lifting a panel. I stood and moved closer, holding the edge steady. For the briefest moment, our hands touched. Nothing dramatic happened. No spark, no shock. And yet my breath caught as if it had. "Perfect," he said, stepping back. "You've got a steady grip." I laughed softly. "Years of grading papers." He smiled, then looked away, returning to his tools a little too quickly. That's when the suspense began, not in the room, but inside me, because I felt it then, the unmistakable sense that something fragile had stepped into the open, something that could either be acknowledged or quietly destroyed by pretending it didn't exist. I told myself this was ridiculous, that loneliness does strange things to the mind, that kindness can feel like something more when you've lived too long without it. And yet, when Jake spoke again, his voice sounded different, lower, careful. "Can I ask you something, Bev?" he asked. I nodded. "Do you ever feel like life just pauses? Like everything keeps moving, but you're stuck in the same place watching?" The question landed heavier than it should have. "Yes," I said, "every day." He exhaled, almost relieved. He thought it was just me. That admission changed everything. This wasn't one-sided. This wasn't imagination. We were both standing at the edge of something unnamed. A while later, I offered him lunch, turkey sandwiches, chips. I kept it simple on purpose, as if simplicity could keep things under control. We sat across from each other, eating quietly. "Most people rush me," he said between bites. "They want it done fast, no talking, no pauses. I don't mind pauses. They make things real." He looked at me then, really looked, not at my age, not at my hands, at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. That's when the doorbell rang. The sound shattered the stillness like glass. My heart began to race. I wasn't expecting anyone. My mind jumped to 100 possibilities, neighbors, delivery, coincidence, but none of them calmed me. "I'll get it," I said quickly, standing. As I walked downstairs, I felt the weight of something unspoken pressing between my shoulder blades. Whatever was happening upstairs didn't belong to the rest of the world, and I feared what would happen if it was exposed too soon. The doorbell rang again, impatient this time. It was just a package. Relief flooded me so fast my knees nearly gave out. When I returned upstairs, Jake was already back at work, as if nothing had happened. But the air felt different now, charged, cautious, like a storm hovering just beyond the horizon. "I should finish up soon," he said. "Just a few adjustments left." I nodded, suddenly aware that his leaving would matter more than it should. As he installed the mirrored doors, the room began to reflect itself, light bouncing where darkness had lived for years. In the mirror, I saw us standing there together. Him, tall, steady, focused. Me, smaller, older, uncertain. And yet, side by side. "I think it suits the room," he said. "Makes it feel open." "Like it's breathing again," I replied. Our eyes met in the reflection. That was the moment everything balanced on a line. Say something and change everything. Say nothing and lose it forever. I looked away first. "I should start putting my clothes back." He nodded. "Of course." He packed his tools slowly, carefully, as if stalling without admitting it. When he finally closed the toolbox, the sound echoed too loudly. "Well, that's the job," he said. I followed him downstairs in silence. In the living room, I signed the work order with a hand that trembled despite my efforts. "Thank you for everything." He hesitated at the door. "I enjoyed today, Bev." "I did too," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He opened the door, then paused. "If anything feels off with the wardrobe, call the company, or, you know." "I know," I said. He smiled once more, small, restrained, and stepped outside. When the door closed behind him, the house fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was heavier, expectant, like the pause between heartbeats. I leaned against the door, my heart racing, knowing with terrifying clarity that something had begun, and that whatever came next would change everything. After Jake left, the house didn't feel empty the way it used to. It felt aware. I stood there for a long time, leaning against the closed front door, listening to the quiet settle back into place. The ticking clock, a car passing outside. My own breathing, uneven and unfamiliar. Nothing in the house had changed, yet somehow everything had. I went upstairs slowly, as if I were entering a room for the first time. The new wardrobe stood against the wall, clean and modern, its mirrored doors reflecting light into corners that had been dim for years. I opened one panel and began placing my clothes inside, folding each piece carefully, deliberately. It felt symbolic, even if I couldn't quite explain why. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, memories and questions looping endlessly. I told myself I was being foolish, that this was nothing more than a moment, a distraction. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the truth. For the first time in 7 years, I felt seen. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window. I noticed how alive the world felt, how sharp the colors were, how the air itself seemed lighter. That's when the phone rang. My heart jumped before I could stop it. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound calm. "Hi, Bev, it's Jake." My fingers tightened around the mug. "I just wanted to check in," he continued. "Make sure everything's holding up okay." "It's perfect," I said honestly. "You did a wonderful job." There was a pause, a small one, but it carried weight. "I'm glad," he said. "Listen, I hope this isn't out of line, but I really enjoyed our conversation yesterday." "So did I replied quietly. Another pause, longer this time. "Would you maybe like to get coffee sometime? Not as a service call, just coffee." I closed my eyes. This was the moment. The sensible voice inside me screamed caution. My age, what people would think, my children, the past, the memory of a life already lived, all the reasons not to step forward. But another voice, one I hadn't heard in years, whispered something else. "You're still here." "Yes," I said, before fear could change my mind. "I'd like that." We met 2 days later at a small cafe not far from my house. Nothing fancy, just coffee and a quiet table by the window. I arrived early, nervous in a way I hadn't felt since I was young. When Jake walked in, something in his expression softened as soon as he saw me. We talked for hours, about nothing and everything, about my teaching days, about his plans, his doubts, his dreams, about loss and how it changes the shape of your life, about how loneliness doesn't always look like sadness, it sometimes looks like routine. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You know, you're not invisible." The words hit harder than he realized, because somewhere along the way, I had started to believe that I was. Days turned into weeks, coffee became walks, walks became dinners. Nothing rushed, nothing hidden, just two people learning each other carefully, respectfully. I laughed more than I had in years. I started dressing differently, not younger, just brighter. I stood a little straighter. I slept better. Even my friends noticed. "You seem lighter," Marge said one afternoon after church, "like you've set something down." Maybe I had. Eventually, my daughter noticed too. "Mom," Sarah said one day, studying me carefully, "is there something you're not telling me?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "I've met someone." Her reaction was exactly what I feared and what I expected. Surprise, concern, questions, lots of questions. I didn't argue, I didn't defend. I simply said, "He makes me feel alive." That word again, alive. There was silence between us after that, long and uncomfortable, but something shifted. "I just don't want you hurt," she said finally. "So do I, but not living hurts too." She didn't say she understood, not then, but she didn't shut me out either, and that was enough for now. One evening, Jake and I sat on my porch as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Fireflies flickered in the yard, just like they used to when David and I first moved here. "I worry sometimes," I admitted, "about what people see when they look at us." Jake was quiet for a moment. "I don't," he said. "I see a woman who lived fully, loved deeply, and still has room in her heart." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Life didn't suddenly become simple. There were awkward moments, side glances, doubts that crept in during quiet nights. But there was also joy, comfort, presence. One afternoon, as I watched Jake adjust something small in the wardrobe, habit more than necessity, I realized something profound. This wasn't about age. It wasn't about replacing the past. It was about choosing not to disappear. I still loved David, I always would. That love didn't vanish, it simply made room. Room for laughter, room for warmth, room for the possibility that life could surprise me again. Standing in that transformed bedroom, sunlight dancing off mirrored doors, I caught my reflection. A woman with silver hair, lines earned honestly, eyes bright with something unmistakable. Hope. At 65, I learned a truth I wish I'd known sooner. Life doesn't end when you lose someone. It pauses, waiting for you to choose it again. And this time, I did.